In recent months, there's been increased focus on the ways that controversial or hot button topics can bring about decisiveness in the classroom. Our three speakers today will discuss how they teach subjects that can be seen as a little bit more controversial or difficult in some other way. In the first part of our session today, our three presenters will share their own experiences facilitating teaching challenging topics and helping facilitate discussion, as well as working with students to create positive learning environments. In the second half of our session, there'll be opportunities for questions and discussion. You're welcome to enter questions or comments into the chat function or to hold on to them and share them yourself in the second half of the presentation. So I'd like to start just by introducing our three presenters, and I'll be introducing them in the order that they will speak today. Janet Locksterman is a professor and chair of the Department of Biological Sciences. She is an evolutionary biologist and conservation geneticist by training. Students in her lab largely work on the evolutionary history and diversification of native fishes. She teaches Biology 1 for majors, genetics, and evolutionary ecology. She was recognized in 2017 as a recipient of ISU's Outstanding Teacher Award. Mark Macbeth is a professor and chair of the Department of Political Science. His research focuses on public policy and environmental policy. He's a 2020 recipient of ISU's Distinguished Researcher Award and a 2005 recipient of ISU's Distinguished Teacher Award. Berenice Sanchez is an assistant professor in the higher education program in the Department of School Psychology and Educational Leadership. Before starting her doctorate at Indiana University, she served as the assistant director of the Latino Cultural Center at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Sanchez's research focuses on Latinas in higher education, systems of oppression within education, and critical race methodologies. Janet, we're going to start off with you.
So thank you, Margaret, for inviting me, and I look forward to hearing the other panelists as well. I, as Margaret said, am an evolutionary biologist. I teach primarily in the department. I taught majors biology, where we would talk about evolution. I would say that is the context under which, if there was any resistance or any challenges that I had, it would have been in our introductory biology course. So I'll talk a little bit about, I'm going to give you a little history of the debate, because I think it's relevant, especially in light of arguments that are currently happening with science in the media to some extent. So this is the debate around evolution and teaching evolution and evolutionary thought is pretty steeped in history, and it's been a controversy historically. There was a law that was put into place in 1925 in Tennessee, was the first that banned the teaching of evolution in the school systems. And this law actually ended up triggering what has been referred to as the Scopes monkey trial. There was a movie made about this called Inherit the Wind, where a teacher was actually arrested and charged for teaching evolution in a public school in Tennessee. He was convicted, and the crime was teaching a theory that denied the story of divine creation. So the challenge here obviously was teaching evolution was something that was viewed to be in direct opposition to the teachings of religion and divine creation. That's the major place where teaching evolution became controversial. In the late 20s, additional states then added laws, and so this became quite a common occurrence to be able to ban the teaching of evolution and evolutionary thought. And this included all of evolution, not just the origins of life or the origins of humans, which tends to be the part of evolutionary thinking that is most controversial, or the hardest part, I would say, to teach and communicate with students in an effective, disarming kind of way. So through much of the early 1900s, even into the mid 1900s, evolution wasn't taught. So evolutionary, not in public schools. So you can see where this would create a pretty big gap. And I'm going to come back to this in a little bit about how we were teaching evolution and evolutionary thinking, because it was against the law to do so in many states to even discuss it. So there was a whole portion of the population then that wouldn't have been exposed to this really central component of biological sciences. In the 60s, these laws began to be challenged and overturned. And when these things were being overturned, this sparked a whole new debate about what was then called balanced time. And so many laws went into place, or states tried to put laws into place that would provide equal time to evolution and evolutionary thinking, but equal time to alternative explanations. This is where things like irreducible complexity and intelligent design began to spark, to grow out of these things. So rather than calling it creationism, it started to be named different things. And there was a lot of argument, especially in southern states, to provide what was called equal time. And even into the 21st century, in 2005, one of the most recent cases happened in Dover, Pennsylvania, where the Dover school district put a law or a rule into place in their public school system for balanced time. 9th grade science curriculum was required to provide an alternative to evolution, and that was intelligent design, had to be taught equal time, and provided the teachers were required to actually read from a script to their 9th grade students about intelligent design as a viable alternative to evolutionary thinking. And so this was actually required, and several parents argued against it. The ACLU and the National Center for Science Education took up the charge, and they challenged the law, or the rule, I should say, and it was ruled against. It was ruled against, citing that intelligent design, as most scientists would view it, is really just another name for creationism. It's not a scientific theory and shouldn't be treated as such. And so it was viewed as a violation of the First Amendment. In most science curricula now, intelligent design has been largely abandoned because it is considered pseudoscience. So I would say we don't see this controversy. I don't think quite as much. It's not the hot topic of the day, as we will find out. There are other topics that seem to have taken the place of challenging evolution and evolutionary theory. So we've been left a little bit alone with this one for now. But what is the problem and why the challenges? One of the major things is based on misconception. So misconception in this case provides, these are barriers to students really understanding the accurate explanations of change over time and of species diversity and adaptations. A misconception in this case is a perception of phenomena occurring in the real world, which is not consistent with a scientific explanation of that phenomena. So this has to do with things that students, preconceived ideas that students have that are actually barriers to them really understanding the underlying principles of evolution and evolutionary thinking. And that's really important as a scientist. That's really important because evolutionary theory is one of the central components of the life sciences. It is one of the unifying principles in biological sciences. So an understanding of that, and it is, even when we don't teach evolution in a class straight up as evolution, it underlies everything that we're talking about. And we see it all the time, and it's in everything that we do. So it really is one of the vital parts of science education, but it also can be misunderstood. And those misconceptions are the primary misunderstanding. Interestingly, most evolutionary biology is much more interested in not where life began or how life began, but what has happened since then. Most of us that either study evolution or teach evolution, it's really after the origin that we're focusing on and that most of us are interested in. And that's the part we really want to teach to students, is not necessarily the origins of life, but what happened after that. Where did all this diversity come from? And those are the important concepts, especially in light of environmental things that are going on right now. If we wanted to mention another topic, which would be global climate change, obviously evolutionary thinking is an important topic as it relates to species' ability to adapt and change with the changing climate and the changing environment. So what are these misconceptions? One of the ones that, and this is one that I hear a lot, I have heard a lot in some of the introductory courses, is that it's just a theory. That evolution and evolutionary theory is just a theory. And in one of the ways that obviously we address that is through the use of our language. In science, as I'm sure the audience knows, in science, the word theory has a different meaning. We view it as something that is supported by a broad array of evidence. And you could think of it as fact. We don't use that because science is ever self-correcting, and we're always adding new pieces of information that might take us in a different direction or modify our hypothesis. But that's one of the great things about science, at least from my perspective. It's one of the reasons I love science, is because you can test ideas and you can change your hypothesis and it can correct itself. And so we know in biological sciences, obviously, that it's not just a theory, but that's one of the challenges, is we have to be very cautious about how we use our language and how we communicate. Another misconception, and I had the image on the previous slide of the monkey to man, which has been probably the bane of our existence, because that's another major misconception, is that humans are descended from monkeys. And so this uncovers another really important misconception, and that is that students don't fully understand the idea of common ancestry and phylogeny, so evolutionary relationships. And that's a place where, when I teach evolutionary ecology, and I've actually taught organic evolution in our department as well, we spend a lot of time, and I have seniors in there that still, I have graduate students actually, that still don't really have a good understanding of how we look at evolutionary relationships, and the idea that a monkey didn't give birth to a human, that's not the way it works. But that is another area that can be very contentious, and students have this misconception that they come in with. The idea that natural selection has a direction, that everything is moving towards the best form of itself, or the most adapted, or the most is just not the way natural selection operates. So again, spending some time with students talking about the actual mechanics of what does it mean for natural selection to operate? Why isn't it purposeful? Why is it the adaptation of today might not be the best thing for tomorrow? But that doesn't matter. It doesn't have, natural selection doesn't have futuristic views in mind. It doesn't know that maybe 5 years from now there won't be water available or something like that. It's what is best fit today. And so it doesn't necessarily have a purpose. Part of the place where intelligent design and irreducible complexity came from was the idea that evolution could not explain complex organs. What you'll hear sometimes, I've heard this from students, is, part of a wing doesn't do you any good. So how could you get to that through an intermediate stage? And the eye is another example, the way the eye works. And what we found is that as we look and as we study, you know, it could be as simple as a cell that can detect light. And you start there, and that gives an organism an advantage. And then there may be another mutation that fine tunes that and allows for directionality. And so evolutionary biologists have actually been able to track many of these things back to very simple systems that did confer an advantage, and those things then changed over time. But again, this is a place where you can have some controversy and some debate with students. And probably the most common one, and the one that you know historically led to laws being put into place, was the idea that religion was incompatible with evolution. And I can tell you that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has no problem with evolutionary thought. The Pope has actually made comments about evolution not being problematic, or not, you know, not being controversial from their standpoint. So I think the important part here is to understand and allow students to realize that religious thought and scientific thought are two different things, and they're two different ways of thinking about things, but that evolution isn't operating in opposition, that it's just a different way of thinking. It's a different system that we work under. So strategies, how can we approach this? Again, I think that spending some time with students understanding, distinguishing the difference between science and religion. And there are places for both of those things. There can be places for both of those types of thought. But when we're talking about science, we're thinking about ways of knowing, we're looking at evidence, we're looking at hypothesis testing and gathering data and allowing the data to take us where we want to go. The idea of a divine entity is not a testable hypothesis. So it's not something that we can put into a scientific context and actually test those ideas. From my standpoint, and I think many of my colleagues' standpoint, one of the major things, and we've seen this more, and this gets a little bit away from evolution and evolutionary thought, but looking at currently the discussion about COVID and the discussion about vaccines, I think there's a real need for more scientific literacy. And as I said, if you go back to those laws that were in place in the 20s up into the late 60s, there's a whole portion of the population that may have never really gotten an education when it came to evolutionary thought. And so there could be significant gaps in the education that people did receive. And now we're put into a position where science and understanding science and scientific literacy, you know, has major implications for public health. And so I think it's important. It's important for science educators to really spend some time working with students on how do we gather evidence? How do we evaluate evidence? And that can be in the context of evolution. That could be in the context of just about anything. I think thinking about evolution in COVID, to me, the fact that we have Delta now, that's evolution, and that's what happens. And there's a reason that people are concerned about, you know, again, not being vaccinated, is this idea of things are going to change over time, and we don't want to see that happen. So I think scientific literacy is a major piece. I think dispelling misinformation, helping students think about how they can reconcile some of their religious or religious thoughts and scientific thoughts can be very important. Obviously, this goes without saying, but creating a respectful learning environment, making sure that you're allowing the sharing of different views and different perspectives, and helping to guide students to look at evidence and think about how they might be able to reconcile some of the thoughts that they have. Being prepared, and it's funny, I was thinking about this the other day. when the previous slide that showed those 5 major misconceptions, I think it's very important that science educators be prepared to share evidence that helps dispel those ideas. So I think it's important to be prepared in the sense that you need to be ready to counter those arguments and provide the data and the evidence to argue against them. Simply saying, you know, it's just the way it is, or it's just evolution, it works this way and that's just the way it is, that's not helpful. And that isn't going to build the trust and respect that you need to have with students if you're going to try and help them reconcile some of their own misconceptions and their own ideas. You have to be able to provide them with thoughtful information that they can then use and integrate into their own learning and their own thought process. And so here are the strategies, I guess, that I would recommend that I have used. And I think this goes without saying probably in all science classes, but you've got to make it relevant to their everyday lives. I think, as I just said with COVID, I talk about evolution in the context of COVID because it's a virus and it's evolving. Every time it replicates, mutations can happen. And if that mutation confers an advantage, now that's going to become replicated and more predominant in the population. Things like antibiotic resistance, students can relate to that. Pesticide resistance, a lot of them grew up in parts of Idaho where they've got different types of organisms attacking their crops. And if you can talk about it in the context to make it relevant to them, there are all kinds of examples you can use both in health and medicine and in agriculture that are very good examples that make it relevant to them and they can see why it would be important. I also tell them that evolution is actually a whole section on the MCAT. So that it really is important for those that want to be physicians. We really want them to have an understanding of evolution and evolutionary thinking. When it comes to the misconceptions, assessing prior knowledge. So it really is important to know where your students are and what their thinking is before you even start to introduce a concept like evolutionary theory, something that is so fundamentally important to biological sciences. So you can do that just through like a 1-minute paper. You can do that through just a quick assessment in class. You can use, we use Mentimeter or Socrative or something like that, where you can do a quick feedback, just asking them some basic questions about where they are, because you can't help them if you don't start where you feel like they are. And you've got to identify where those misconceptions might be. They might have some, they might not have others. And so it is important to figure out where they are and meet them there. Some of the tools that we use or that I have used are concept inventories or concept maps. Is we can give them the ideas and have them draw the connections. And if they can see how the different parts of evolution and evolutionary thinking and evolutionary processes work, and they can see those connections and draw those connections. It could be something you would do with things like phylogenies or common ancestry, evolutionary trees, those types of things. We've used concept maps to help teach phylogenetics, to uncover places where students might be confused. So it's another place to identify, have them do the work, them build it out, and then you can identify again where those gaps might be or where those misconceptions might be and help correct those. Allowing students, metacognition, having students do some sort of self-reflection and self-assessment, take some responsibility for their learning, thinking about where they are, how confident they are in understanding the concepts and the connections between the concepts. I did actually, when I first taught biology 1101 many, many years ago, I did have a faculty member tell me, well, you can just tell them that they don't have to believe in evolution, but it's going to be on the test. And I suppose that's one route you could go. I've always felt that it was better to have them see to help them see the value in learning it and understanding it, and understand that it isn't contradictory to what belief system they might have, or it doesn't have to be. And then one of the best tools we can use in all science classes, but certainly when we're talking about evolution, is using active learning and use data. Provide them with data sets and have them look at the data and uncover the pattern themselves. And again, you can relate this back to number one, in the sense that if you can make it relevant, so you can provide them with a data set, a real data set, and have them make their own hypothesis, develop their own idea about what are the data telling me and what is happening, and then relate that back maybe to some concept that is happening or something in their daily lives, something that they would feel is relevant to them, and allowing them to discover the process. I think that's the best way. I think that's the best way to teach any of these concepts, is to give them the data. That's what scientists do. And so I think providing them with the tools to be able to look at data, develop hypotheses, and then test those to see if their data support it is one of the best tools we have to use. And so then I don't know if you're going to share these slides, Margaret, what you're planning to do. I know you're recording, but I don't know. For all of the scientists in the audience that want to teach evolution, here are some really good websites to get information about tools to use and how to, a lot of it has to do, as I said, with misconceptions and helping students correct those misconceptions and build new learning, that after you undo the misconception, you can build new knowledge on top of a better foundation.
Okay. So as I approach this topic, I thought I would talk a little bit about what I know about our students at ISU and the changes I've seen in our students over the past 30 years, and then how that plays into teaching controversial issues. And I want to also talk a little bit about pedagogy and kind of consistent pedagogical approaches that might help us when we approach controversial issues, regardless of the topics or the discipline that we're teaching. So in political science, some of the topics that controversial issues that we might talk about, sexual harassment, things like hate speech, race, gender, sexuality, the role of government, including the vaccinations, and maybe the causes of economic inequality. Those are all issues that maybe I've probably taught just in the last few weeks, just this semester. So what I'm going to present today is first a little notion of generational politics, but who are our students, right? Because I think if we can understand where our students are coming from and how this generation, Generation Z, thinks about politics, that's probably going to help us understand how they might approach topics in various courses. Then political polarization, which is probably the reason we're here, because of political polarization in the United States and in Idaho. That has led to questions about how we deal with controversial issues in classrooms and the role of faculty in dealing with controversial issues. And then I'll talk about some pedagogical theories dealing with controversial issues, and then give some practical teaching tips. Okay, here we go. So I use a book in the class I teach called Introduction to Politics by Russell Dalton. And so Russell Dalton introduced me to the idea of generational politics. His book came out about 2009. That's when I started using it. And so he is a political scientist at the University of California, Irvine. He's probably in his mid-70s now. And he has been studying young people for much of his career, probably the last 40 years. And he's actually very positive about the future of young people and politics. And so one of my key takeaways from my talk today is our assumptions about students. I think if you have good assumptions about students, it's going to help when you're dealing with controversial issues, because you're going to have good assumptions about them and not necessarily negative assumptions, right? There's another view of young people, of Generation Z, of this generation, and that's the idea of Lukianoff and hate, right? That young people are coddled, and that they don't like to confront difficult ideas, and that they will actually shut down when we start talking about controversy. But Dalton has this great quote that I always use at the beginning of my 202 course, where he says, older people typically castigate the young for not being like themselves. This has been true since the time of Aristotle, and they attribute negative political developments to the eroding values and poor behavior of the young. That is what old people do the best. They complain. Right? My students always love that quote. I usually have like a cartoon, a Simpsons cartoon. Remember Grandpa Simpson yelling at a cloud, right? I usually use that cartoon in that part of the lecture. So Generation Z, what do we know from political science literature about Generation Z? So most students that we're teaching now at ISU were born somewhere between 1999 and 2003. And so they are part of Generational Z. They are the generation after the millennials. They are more educated, like compared to previous generations. They're more diverse. They're more nonpartisan, which I think is really helpful for teaching political science. And they're more likely to view government as a potentially positive force. So those are all positive things. However, the literature also argues the millennials are also less trusting of government. They're more skeptical of government authority, and they're also more skeptical of governmental institutions, which becomes problematic when you start talking about things like vaccinations and public health departments and those kind of things. Their life experiences, whoops, I misspelled that. I have an English, oops, sorry, Margaret. I misspelled a word there. Their life experience are also are different than mine, right? I always talk about with my students, I'm a late baby boomer, and they have different life experiences, and they have faced more difficulties really than my generation. And in fact, they've inherited a lot of problems from my generation. So one of the things that about Generation Z is that they can tend to be pessimistic about the future. So this is a new study. I've actually started a pedagogy study. I only have 20, my end's only 23 because I just started it this semester. But this is pretty interesting. If you look at our students in terms of pessimism or optimism, they're pretty optimistic about things like racial equality, gender equality, sexual equality, but they're actually pretty pessimistic about things like climate change, affordable public higher education, and economic inequality or the possibility of economic equality. Right? And those are issues that are, I think, somewhat unique to this generation. Again, I believe these are issues or problems that they have inherited mainly from my generation, from the baby boom generation. I also asked my students this semester about, are they pessimistic or optimistic about the future? So you can see there that about 51 or 52% of our students, of my 23 students, are more pessimistic because of the pandemic. Although about 30% have argued that the pandemic has actually made them more optimistic. So just think about, have empathy. My first point is have empathy with our students. They are inheriting problems that they did not create, but for which they have to live with and deal with. So things like climate change, economic inequality, unaffordable public higher education, those are all problems that was really created by my generation, the baby boom generation. But yet Generation Z has to live with these problems and try to solve with these problems. So my first point is have some empathy with them. Okay. I also think it's interesting. I asked them in this semester, when you take a class, when you take a political science course, you know, do you want to just understand what's wrong with the world, what's right with the world? Do you want just good news or do you want bad news? Well, you can see 91% of my students actually said they hope the course will help them understand both what is right and wrong with the world. So this generation is not shy from dealing with problems and trying to get to the causes of problems. So another issue, of course, is political polarization. Again, I think that's the reason that we're here. Is we are in a very, very politically polarized time in the United States. So political polarization is this growing gap between liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats. So I've been studying this in my classes for the last several years. And I think this plays into partially how I try to teach controversial issues. So there's a couple theories of political polarization. There's more than that, but it's just for our sake today. Abramowitz and Webster talk about negative partisanship. So negative partisanship is this view that the data shows that we actually dislike the other political party more than we like our own political party. It's not that the students in our class are really strong Democrats or really strong Republicans. It's just that if they just really dislike Democrats or they really dislike Republicans. And then Liliana Mason, who is at Maryland University, she talks about affective polarization. That our polarization is really based on emotion and on political identity and on creating in-groups and out-groups, right? And Mason's work at University of Maryland shows that in reality, if you look at data on policy issues, on what government should do, there's wide-scale agreement between blue districts, Democratic district, congressional districts, and red Republican districts. But nonetheless, as she says here very nicely, the U.S. is a nation that may agree on many things, but is bitterly divided nonetheless. But I think that's interesting to know or helpful to know when you teach controversial issues, that much of the polarization is not based on public policy, what government should do. It's based more on emotion and on creating out groups and disliking the other political party more than you actually like your own political party. Okay. So I've been doing a polarization survey, and this is probably from about a year ago. So I've updated it, but the findings have not changed much. But I want to try to figure out like how polarized are our students. So interesting, these are some questions that are typically used in polarization research. So would you be upset if your son or daughter marries someone with a different political ideology? Right. Well, only 11% of my students are polarized. They say yes. But if you look at table 2, what's the likelihood that you would marry someone of the opposite political party? Right. Well, there, 54% of my students who have taken the survey would say that it's very unlikely or unlikely that they would marry someone of the opposite political party. Okay, that's classic affective polarization or negative partisanship, right? We just dislike the other political party. Okay, you can see there the views of the opposite political party. About 68% of the students who've taken my survey have a favorable or very unfavorable or very unfavorable view of political parties. Notice that 30% don't identify with the political party. That is that Generation Z, which is increasingly breaking away from parties and becoming more independent. It's important, table 4, it's important to live in a place where most people share my values. About 41% of students agree with that. So that's a polarized type of response. And about 59% of students say that close friends share my political beliefs. We spent a lot of time in my 202 course talking about bridging social capital. And bridging social capital is when we bridge and network with people who are unlike us, who have different political beliefs. But you see our students, about 59% of our students have friends that share their political beliefs. And that's partially because most of our students as freshmen grew up in Idaho, and their friends are mainly folks who are close to home and maybe they went to high school with. So if I create a little affective polarization index, this kind of in-group, out-group index, you can see that about 43% of my students, are moderate to extreme polarization. Okay, and that's actually a little bit less than what you would expect probably in a general study of people older than Generation Z, but there is polarization in Generation Z. But I would argue that really what they're doing is they are just mimicking the polarization that's been created by my generation, by the baby boom generation, and that their fights really aren't their own generational fights. They are basically often getting caught up in fights that my generation created. Okay, but then this is interesting. This gets back to Ileana Mason's point. If you look at where things should end up when you look at the most important issues facing the country, start looking at policy, you notice here you get very little polarization, right? Only 13% of my students say Republicans should get everything. Only 18% say Democrats should get everything. Instead, right, you'll see that most students believe both sides should get equal, that both sides should listen to each other, right? So these two columns right here, I think, are really interesting. It makes the point that really our students are not polarized on what government should do or what even the most important issues facing our country are. Where they are polarized are in, they create these out groups. They really dislike Republicans or they really dislike Democrats. It's not necessarily that they disagree about where the country should go or what the most important issues are facing the country. That helps me when I am teaching controversial issues. Okay, so I think that point is that young people have partially inherited the politics of previous generations, and they're fighting maybe the fights that my generation created, not their generation. And so I actually play that in class. I'm the baby boomer. I'm 37 years older than my students are. And when I started teaching at ISU, I was 27 years old. And so I kind of give this history of my teaching. And I talk a lot about this generation compared to the generation I taught 30 years ago, and how this generation can handle more difficult issues compared to previous generations, partially because they're more diverse and they're used to having disagreement. Whereas my students in 1991 did not really come from a background where they had to deal with diversity and disagreement. So my third point is, right, have these good assumptions about your students, have good assumptions that they are willing to confront difficult issues, and they are no more polarized than previous generations. In fact, they're less polarized. Okay, some pedagogical theories, and I think I see about 4 of our PI book panel in the audience. I need to turn my cell phone back on so I can see what time I'm at. So I have a kind of a basic pedagogical theoretical approach that I use in all my courses. So I try to use cognitive science-based knowledge of how individuals learn. So that's the book Eiler that I'm doing a PI reading panel on, and also a book by Lang on small teaching, right? So Eiler talks about things like promoting curiosity, the use of sociality, the effective use of emotion to connect students with the material, authenticity, and help students deal with failure. Okay, I use a constructivism approach to teaching, and I also use kind of these pedagogical ideas particularly from Eiler, right? Don't be scary. Don't you realize, particularly as you get older, like I have gotten older at ISU, that you quickly become an authority figure, and you can scare students away to where they won't talk with you. They won't talk about their concerns because they see you as an authority figure. And that was not a problem when I was 27 years old, but it is more of a problem now. So don't be scary. Accept emotion as part of learning, that when you deal with some of the issues that we deal with in political science, that students are going to get emotional. And there was an episode last week where I'm teaching with one of our doctoral students. So I was in the classroom kind of as a student. I was running the Zoom board, the Zoom chat feature, because we're doing a high flex model. And my team teacher was doing a great job talking about hate speech. And I was upset. I'm upset about this court case. There was a court case, Rav versus St. Paul, in which the Supreme Court allowed an individual to burn a cross on the family of an African American family's lawn. And they argued that you cannot ban that because you cannot ban the content of speech. And that case has always made me upset. It goes back, that case came out in 1992. So I was kind of out in the audience, and I was kind of trying to go against this case. And the students were very emotional that day because we were dealing a lot with hate speech versus and emotion versus how the court believes that political tolerance is an essential part of democracy, right? So accept emotion as a part of learning. Don't see that if your students get emotional, that is a bad thing, but try to figure out how you can kind of help students control and regulate that emotion. It's also really important that you build authentic teacher-student relationships, right? So, learn your students' names. I think that might be on my next slide, but learn their names, talk to them, So then when a difficult issue comes up in your class, you've already built those relationships, and there's some element of trust that they're going to listen to you, and they know you're not going to try to do them any harm, that you're just trying to get them to think critically and look at evidence, right? And then don't have bad assumptions about your students, again, right? Have good assumptions. I just also want to say last Friday when I was teaching, I had this really wonderful discussion with my students using a documentary where a high school student wore an anti-gay message on their t-shirt to school. The question was whether or not the high school was justified in banning the message on the t-shirt. And we had this wonderful in-class 25-minute discussion. It was a discussion that I thought would take 10 minutes. It went for 25 minutes. And I had the vast majority of my class involved in that discussion. And we had disagreement in the class about whether or not this speech should be allowed or not. But it was very mature. It wasn't really very emotional. And I actually praised my students, and I said, this was a conversation I could not have had in my class in 1991, 30 years ago when I started, right? And I praised them for their ability to really confront these difficult issues. And so I think kind of modeling, when you have a good discussion, you reinforce that with the students, and you kind of model, show them kind of modeling, right? This is how we have discussions at a university. This is how we agree and how we disagree, how we ask questions. I was just really, really proud of them. Some practical teaching tips. I try to establish ground rules for discussion and lecture early in the class. So things like respect, listen, and empathy, right? Empathy is a really big part of my teaching philosophy. We have to empathize with each other, understand where we're coming from. And if someone says something in class that seems a little bit off target, well, we try to understand where that student's coming from. Right? So, or we have discussions in my class, for example, why do rural communities and African Americans, for example, have low vaccination rates? Well, I give them some background on why that's the case, that African Americans and rural community members have not traditionally had real good experiences with big pharma, with big pharmaceutical companies, or with medicine itself, right? So try to have empathy. I try to encourage my students not to argue from authority and to link their claims and assertions to appropriate evidence, right? We call that system two thinking, using Kahneman's notion of thinking fast and thinking slow. Have students recognize that confusion and uncertainty are stages in their development toward independent opinion, because the students are going to start out with an opinion, and then I'm going to talk, the students are going to talk, and they're going to get confused a little bit, but accept confusion, uncertainty, when you talk about controversial issues, that's part of learning and how you form independent opinion, right? And then praise students for discussions where there's disagreement, or where civility wins out. Again, last Friday, a classic example in my class. Okay. Quickly, some real fast practical teaching tips. And these are just things I've learned over the years. Don't be preachy, right? Young people do not create current problems. So don't preach to them, teach them. Admit that you can be wrong and that you too are subject to cognitive bias. So I love this term, epistemological modesty. Part of how we have to get over polarization in this country is we need to realize that we don't know everything. And I try to have epistemological modesty with my students. I try to help my students understand the difference in political science between the interpretation facts and facts, that facts are real, but we disagree about the meaning of those facts. And I try to help them understand why we disagree, why political ideology plays in, or why our life experiences, or why our economic background, those things might cause us to interpret climate change, for example, in different ways. Climate change is real, but how we interpret climate change comes from our differences in background and how we interpret things. Know your students as people and respect them. Know their names, right? I have 25 students in 202. Every time they walk in the room, I say their name and I write down their name to take attendance. And I've learned their names. It took me about 6 weeks, but I've learned all their names. Be patient, right? Remember, these are young people. They're just approaching the world and different views in the world for the first time. They're in their teens or early 20s. Be patient, give them time to develop and think and grow. Don't expect them to know everything right away. And don't politically stereotype your students. Don't assume that they're going to be really conservative or really liberal or really against this, right? Don't stereotype them. That's one of the topics of my course, how we stereotype each other. And we're often very wrong in our political stereotypes. And then lastly, don't blame young people for restating an older generation's views of the world. Slides off there, right? Because often in my class, when we get into arguments in my class, it's usually, I'll remind them, you are fighting the fights of a previous. I try to teach Generation Z, right, that this is their world to try to conquer and to improve and to try to approach a world from their much more diverse. That's my presentation.
So I will caveat this with saying I think I'm definitely the oddball out of the group for a couple of reasons. So I teach in the higher education program, which is solely graduate students. It's all doctoral level students. Almost 100% of our students are current working professionals that take classes in the evening, and our program is a fully online program. And so we don't ever meet in a face-to-face capacity. So that would be the first thing. This is my second year at Idaho State, and I will have to say that it flip to the situation that Mark was stating with his students. Most of my students are significantly older than I am, and so I think I encounter some of that issue sort of in reverse, right? Because these are folks that are a little older than me, and also have been working within institutions of, different colleges and universities, almost always within Idaho, but we do have some students from outside of Idaho as well, right? And so a lot of my students are very sort of set in their ways, their worldviews, their values, that sort of thing. And so in bringing in some challenging or difficult subjects tends to make the atmosphere potentially a little more difficult, right? And so I think that that's where a lot of my challenges or different approaches is trying to account for that. And lastly, my presentation is very practical. That's who I teach. I teach practitioners. And so I teach in a way where it is very practical and tangible for folks. I rarely, if ever, lecture. And so I want to have more of a conversation. So I'll make it relatively quick so that we can have sufficient time to be able to engage in more of that dialogue. But again, just trying to sort of set the context specifically within Idaho. So I teach in higher ed. My research areas, as you all have, got to hear, is I focus most of my research focuses on the intersection of race and gender, particularly looking at Latinas within higher ed. So I focus on critical race theory is one of the main frameworks that I use in a lot of my work. And so coming into Idaho, especially over the last academic year, was very interesting in dealing with Idaho Bill H377 and the conversation, right, around not just within the state, but also nationally on sort of the misperception of what CRT is, sort of this attack of CRT and whether it has the space, not just at our K-12 institutions, but just education as a whole or society and conversations in general. And so that has been really interesting sort of in how I'm navigating, right? Having a lot of these conversations that have should be taking place in these, classrooms, should be had amongst professionals who are preparing to or currently working with our college students across the state and having to deal, right, with the increasingly diverse student body that they're, having to deal with either within their offices and their classrooms, that sort of thing. So again, to give you a little more context, I teach only graduate students. Some of the classes where I think this topic of challenging topics or challenging content to teach has really come up in two of the classes that I teach. One is a equity and inclusion in higher education class, which really is just 16 weeks of exploring different identities and their impact on students' experiences within higher education. So we talk about anything from gender to race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic class, ability status, religious differences, any identity that may be implicated in some sort of systemic oppression that happens within campus, right? And so we cover topics like the concept of white fragility, white supremacy as a whole, systemic oppression and how it impacts education and our society as a whole. And then again, critical issues connected to identity. The other place where it's come up a little bit is in the history and philosophy of American higher education. It's a pretty basic history of higher ed. We go from the colonial colleges to current day, how our institutions have evolved, expanded, that sort of thing. But we talk about very early, week 1 or 2 in the class, we talk about the connection of slavery with the colonial colleges, discrimination of students who were not white Christian middle class men. So when we're talking about really the original purpose of higher education and who it was created for, back when Harvard and all of the other colonial colleges were created. So we have some of those conversations, and oftentimes it'll get connected to things like names of buildings, monuments of, certain historical figures that are on campuses or in towns, on college campus, in communities where colleges and universities are placed. And so a lot of those current hot topic debates that are happening just in society end up trickling into these classes just because of the nature of the conversations and the content that we're reading, in our classes. My teaching philosophy, again, because I teach all graduate students who are working professionals, is really threefold. And the first piece to develop students' critical consciousness. One of the things that I tell my students off the bat is that they're not in my classroom to learn specific content, right? Like I'm not going to lecture at you about what we already read. You all are graduate students. You all definitely have the skills to read, the content that's assigned in the readings and sort of make sense of it as your own. So in our classroom, we have more of conversations of applying a lot of that content to their real world experiences and real world conversations, right? And so we're talking about how the content that we're reading or the histories that we're reading are then connected to larger systems of power, privilege, and oppression, and how they're present within higher education. They're engaging in the co-creation of knowledge. So similar to what Mark and Janet were talking about, like bringing in their own personal experiences and how that's connected to the content that we're covering in class, especially when we are covering subjects that may be a little more uncomfortable or touchy for certain students. Having them connected to their own personal experiences often helps them sort of work through, right, some of the challenges that they're having with the topics. And then the third is embracing their voice as change agents. So again, thinking about how is it that they're taking what they're learning and reading in the course to then be able to apply it in the work that they do every day and hopefully push for change, right? Oftentimes when they're in, I think all of you will probably do this as well, right? Like when you're part of the system and working with the system, there's so many things that we are always encountering day to day that we hope would change to, make a more equitable situation for our students or be more beneficial to the successful learning of our students and successful progression through their degree programs. And so that's the third piece of what I really focus on is making sure that they have a good understanding that we're not just having these difficult conversations for no reason in the classroom, but it's for them to really be able to fully engage with the current issues in higher education and then be able to then apply a lot of this hopefully new and better developed understanding of higher education to then make some positive changes on their own campuses. So in thinking about tips and strategies, right, and approaching some of these really difficult conversations, I think I definitely am covering subjects that are more taboo as of, lately. I also recognize that, again, I'm much younger, I'm very young presenting. I'm also a woman of color engaging in these conversations. And so I also come to it with the full understanding of my students are perceiving me very differently having these conversations, as opposed to if I held different identities, how might they perceive me and trying to engage them in these conversations. So that's something that I think is very important to name and call out, that part of having some of these difficult conversations are particularly difficult for certain faculty because of circumstances that are out of your control, right? And so, and thinking about engaging in these classes, and in particular in these conversations, and in particular in these two classes, there's a lot of pre-planning that has to happen. So some of the things that I try to make sure to do is making sure that the readings represent a diverse group of scholars with different perspectives. I think all of us in our respective fields, right? There's foundational texts that always get taught. There's foundational scholars that always get referenced. And I think oftentimes what's missing in the classroom is bringing in some of those perspectives that aren't as often listened to. And at least within higher education, most of those voices tend to be those scholars who are women or scholars who are scholars of color. Those are usually the ones that aren't involved. And so I try to be really intentional, right? We're still going to cover the foundational scholars because, student affairs practitioners are expected to know this stuff. And also we're going to read perspectives from a diverse range of other scholars to be able to hear multiple perspectives. Again, I limit the amount of time that I lecture, because I think for a couple of reasons. One, I think it's a protective mechanism for me as a scholar of color, who's engaging in these difficult conversations where there's also state legislation with very clear messaging around indoctrination and that sort of thing, where I think can be a very fine line between what I perceive as lecturing and engaging in a conversation and what a student might perceive as me lecturing being more of indoctrination, right? And so for that reason, and to try to remove myself, right, from potentially a debate or in put in that situation, I really do limit my time to lecture, and I structure the class so that it's much more an opportunity for them to engage in conversation amongst each other as a community. I talk about the classroom as a community of scholars, right? Where in the class, they're not in there necessarily just to intake the content that I'm providing for them via the syllabus, but it's an opportunity for them to really make sense of it and, co-create knowledge together as a community of scholars. So I think that has worked pretty well for me. I also, from the readings, and this is where I do a lot of journaling beforehand when I do classes, and thinking about what was the conversation that we were having in the previous week? What are some things that have consistently come up? And so then when I prepare for classes, I think of discussion questions that are connected to the readings that they were assigned in that week, but then also trying to take it back to, conversations that have been consistently coming up in class, or situations, right, that they're bringing up, or current context, whatever is going on either in the state of Idaho or nationally around higher ed, and how some of those conversations might be impactful to the work that they do every day, and bring those into the topic for the week. And then also providing space for students to have some time to reflect on their readings. I think that that's one of the piece that I have found with having them and not just engage these difficult topics in the classroom, but assigning readings that may also bring up, right, or that are focused on some of these difficult issues around race and racism in particular, is to give them the time, not just to read the content, but to do some sort of reflecting after they've read, right? So I'll do things where I'll have them maybe write a very short discussion post. I tend to not like to do those because I feel like students feel like they're busy work a lot of the times. So I oftentimes will have them come up with their own discussion questions or questions that came up for them as they were reading. And if it's, a question that's consistently coming up across students, then I might pull it in and make it a central discussion question that we can engage with the entire class. So things like that to make them feel like they're being included. And if a topic is really challenging, that I'm able to meet them where they are, right? Like if they're really struggling with something about a conversation of the connection of slavery to the creation of higher education, if they're really struggling with sort of making sense of, that historical piece of information, then how might we be able to flesh it out or find some parallels or things like that where they can sort of wrap their mind around histories that they may have not known, and most students don't know right before they walk into the classroom or the Zoom classroom. During class, again, going back to I think what Mark was sharing about establishing clear rules, I tend to leave that as a blank slate for them to create their own rules. I also leave it as a working document where, and let them know that we can stop and revisit the rules from, at any point in the semester. The one rule that I do put on there is that, and this is something that was taught to me, is the moving away from, I don't say that I want the classroom space to be a safe space, because I think that that's often an opportunity for students who don't want to engage to just shut down and not be part of the conversation. And so I say that, right, that this space is not intended to be a safe space, because difficult topics tend to push folks to be in uncomfortable situations. And so my ground rule is sort of the understanding of everybody at some point in time is going to feel some level of uncomfortableness, and that's fine, right? Like that's part of the learning process when we're talking about these topics. Again, preparing open-ended questions to connect to the readings, and always being ready to come up with the follow-ups. I think especially for students who are really struggling with certain conversations. So like last week in one of my courses, we got on talking about Columbus Day, right? And whether we should celebrate Columbus Day or not. And, now we're, several places or several institutions, organizations are adopting the Indigenous Peoples Days, right? And so understanding the meaning of that, right? And then talking about why doesn't everybody know the true history of Columbus, right? And why wouldn't we just all together drop it? And, was really struggling with that. Like, it should just be common sense. We really should just learn the true history around Columbus Day and just drop that day altogether and go with Indigenous Peoples Days. And so I think that that's where a lot of the follow-up questions of trying to really understand where are they coming from, what's their perspective behind, why they're asking certain questions or making certain statements, and trying to parallel what they're trying to make sense of to maybe another issue or another topic that they may have a better grasp on, right? So to make some of those parallel connections for them. And then the last piece for during class topics, which is a difficult one to stick to oftentimes, is the acknowledging that some form of silence is okay sometimes, giving folks, I think not all of our students are always really quick to want to answer. Some folks, need to really process what they want to say or want to be really careful about what they say. It ends up being a little tricky in my end as well, because there's also power dynamics of oftentimes there might be coworkers that are in a class together, or folks who are like hierarchically, like, not a direct supervisor, but like a supervisor of a supervisor, and that might be in the same class. And so I think oftentimes there's some level of discomfort in sharing certain things. And so I do give, folks the time to just sort of sit in silence at times, especially when we're dealing with some of these trickier topics. And then lastly, after the class, I think always thinking about before jumping into the next class session, and we meet on a weekly basis. So at the very beginning of every week, I always give students the opportunity to bring up any lingering thoughts from the last week's class. Again, some folks just need more time to process. Some folks have gone out and read other things and want to bring them in and have more perspectives on, whatever it is that we were talking about the previous week and want to delve into that a little bit more. Again, I'm always journaling to try to see what things either are trigger points, if there's certain things that are triggering to certain students, like making sure that I try to stay away from that or figuring out, right, how I can include them in conversations in ways that they don't feel targeted, I think is also really important. And then keeping up with conversation on a lot of these issues, again, especially around race and education around race in this country, keeping up on the status of those issues on a state, national, and international level.
That's great. Thank you so much. Well, I first of all thank all three of you. As I always do in these events, I take a lot of notes to try to keep in mind things I want to pay attention to in the future. I'd like to open it up for any questions or comments, observations from anybody here. If anyone has a question they'd like to ask, you're welcome to just jump in.
I just had a thing that I wanted to share, what Dr. Sanchez was saying. So I also come from a program that deals with adults as students, and I also come from graduate school, two graduate schools where the primary students were, in most of the cases, the students were much older than the teachers, right, and professors. So people from different, so for example, in my doctoral program, so a lot of people from the higher academia were coming back to school to get their EDD so that they could go in for different deanships and things like that. So for very technical reasons, they're coming. So they're coming with a rich history of working, established, and then so one thing, it's kind of difficult to teach these people. So they've got their own very specific way of thinking, and because they've been in that managerial positions or even scholarly level for such a long period of time, it's generally my way or highway. So immediately those things come up. And the second thing is, even in very liberal states and liberal, so-called liberal universities, teaching anything critical, in most of the cases, it's like opening a Pandora's box, right? So a recent case that in my last semester, I was assisting a professor, and she's, again, one of the most well-known people in the field, and she doesn't have a racist bone in her body. And then she's close to her 80s, but she was teaching a course that has been taught for many years. But in that particular class, there was a unique issue that just came up, and nobody had thought of addressing that particular issues, and that concern about the history of that field. So in that particular program, so all incoming students are kind of guided through of how the program has evolved, how that particular field has evolved for the last 80, 90 years, right from the times of John Dewey and people like that. So a group of students then, it just came up, organically in one of the discussions. And one particular person and a group of students just pointed out that they're not saying the course was racist, but there's just no discussion of any other race other than a very specific Eurocentric arguments that's prevalent in the history of the United States. So all of us, the TAs, the professors, and the whole department as such, we just took a step back, and then when we analyzed the thing. It was kind of very strange. So things like these, when we teach in adults, so it brings up extremely difficult conversations, and it's challenging for everybody. The students were kind of, they were saying informally to us as TAs, they could converse with us because both of our students, some of them were saying, they felt bad that they brought up the issue in such a way because everybody was not taken back, right? So we just needed to stop back for a few days and look at, and the professor handled it perfectly well, beautifully well. But it just brought up that difficult conversations because some of the things in our history were just taken for granted and some of the things are not centered, right? So those conversations are extremely challenging and difficult.
Do any of our panelists have a response you'd like to make to that?
No, other than to say that I agree with you. I've taught courses where it was all undergrad students and even master's level students, and teaching doctoral students, right, who are very established in their careers and very set in their ways and have probably had another degree already that's, you know, connected to in some way, shape, or form education, I think can be really challenging when you're deviating from the traditional curriculum, right? And bringing in some new perspectives. I think it can be really challenging, and also I think at times really rewarding, right? To get those aha moments from students. They don't happen very often. I think I get equal amount aha moments from students, and I absolutely hate this class and don't want to take this professor anymore from students. And so it can be very challenging and potentially also very rewarding.
Thank you to the panelists for this panel. This was very helpful and extremely informative. My question is for Dr. Sanchez. I'm in the PI reading group that Mark referenced, and we're reading the Eiler book that he talked about. And in that book, he talked about the benefits of providing trigger warnings to your students and also some of the difficulties that surround that. And I heard you reference that in your journaling process, you make notes of different things that you identified as triggering to your students. And I wondered about how you went about that in the class. Like, do you provide trigger warnings? Do you try to avoid certain topics based on your notes? How do you handle that?
I don't avoid topics. So I think it's challenging, right? Because I think the students who have very distinct trigger warnings or have, you know, many things that, or many topics that trigger them, those are usually the students that probably need to be pushed a little bit more and challenged a little bit more. And so I think I think about that as well, right? Like I try to make sure that if there's certain things that are triggering to them, I make sure that I'm very intentional about how I might broach topics so they don't feel like they're targeted. So I don't just say, you know, like, hey, Megan, I, you know, noticed that last week you were really triggered when we talked about this. Let me ask you specifically this question. But it's usually like, I'll try to figure out a way to reintegrate it back into the conversation and then try to engage in some more follow-up questions. So I do that. I don't necessarily also do sort of trigger warnings because I think that for a couple of reasons. One, I think that it oftentimes can then set the stage so that students who will say like, oh, well, I am triggered by this topic, will just shut down and not engage. And I think that that's always, and that's the opposite of what I want to happen. And again, in full disclosure, my dissertation or my doctoral advisor was a Black woman who focused on race and racism in higher education. And she would always tell us in our classes, like students of color, students who are directly impacted by a lot of the systemic oppression that happens in higher education don't ever get trigger warnings when they're going to be discriminated against or microaggressed in the classroom. And so she's like, in that way, I'm also not going to try to protect students who aren't regularly facing that from things that might make them feel uncomfortable, because part of their growing is they first need to just sit with the feeling uncomfortable before they can just be okay with then starting to engage in the conversations. And so I don't try to minimize or avoid them being able to fully go through that process. And so I think it's much more for me of like, this is a trigger for certain students, meaning they're probably struggling with these concepts. And so I need to figure out a way to reintegrate them back into a later class session so we can continue the conversation.
Thank
I
you.
hope that answered. Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, I hope that answered the question.
I know we received a question that was specifically for Mark a little earlier from Michelle Anderson. And Michelle had to leave, but she did send me a message before she left to ask if you could still answer that. And I'm going to get back to her on the answer. And she asked, when you were sharing some of the statistics from the survey, she asked, would you suspect that the polarization would be different in students who selected different specialties or majors, or stay similar to what you found?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So the course that I was sharing the data from is Political Science 2202. And it's actually a general education course and a required major course. So it's probably about 50-50. And I don't actually break out the data by major versus general education. My guess is students who are drawn to political science might actually be more polarized because it's initially drawn, like an emotional drawn to something, a certain topic or a certain viewpoint. And my guess is students who are taking the class who are maybe coming from a science background or taking for general ed might be less polarized. But that'd be fascinating. I think that's a fascinating question. So that's just my conjecture there, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, it is interesting to wonder about that. I wanted to ask one other question, which is that I think Janet brought up the challenge that preconceived ideas have in teaching, that the way students come in thinking ends up bumping against what we're trying to teach sometimes. And I know, Janet, you included a couple examples of ways you address that. But it seems to me all three of you are teaching courses where those preconceived ideas have an impact on how open your students are to hearing new information. And I was wondering if there are other strategies that maybe haven't been mentioned yet that might be used as ways to get to some of that preconceived knowledge and help with figuring out how to address it further. And that's open to any of you.
I can share quickly. I've done it in a couple of my classes, having students do like a positionality statement. So I'm teaching a qualitative methods research class now, where we'll do a positionality statement and sort of go through their identities and whatever biases or value system they might bring to the classroom and also to their research. So I've done that, or I've done things like having them do personal history paper where they'll go through the history of their family in this country and what are some of their identities that are most salient to them, and how do those identities impact how they live their life day to day, because then I'm able to try to connect some of those pieces, really some of the values or really more salient identities that they may have, and try to connect it with later course content.
And I was just going to say, so Janet mentioned metacognition. So in most of my courses, I deal a lot with some cognitive psychology and how that's drifted into political science. So how we make decisions and how we make mistakes. So like my 202 course starts out with cognitive dissonance, confirmation bias, things like negativity bias, and then things like filter bubbles, how social media will push us information that confirms our bias. And so, and then system 1, system 2, which is Kahneman's thinking fast, thinking slow. And I once I have those kind of concepts down, as we're dealing with issues in the course, I make the students kind of revisit how they make decisions, and are they using system 2, which is very emotional, or system 1, which is very emotional, or are they using system 2, which is much more rational? So I really like the idea that Janet mentioned metacognition, because I just think helping students understand how they make decisions and how they might have previous knowledge and it might be wrong, and they discover that themselves, and rather than me having to point out that they're wrong, they kind of discover it themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the biggest, for me, that's one of the biggest challenges in science, at least, is the misconceptions and trying to undo some of that, because any new knowledge you give them, they're going to build on the scaffold of the mistakes that they already have ingrained. And so trying to back that up and get them, but they have to, I mean, that's one of the biggest challenges I think I have, is they have to be the ones that come to that. I can't tell them they're wrong. I can't tell them that the way they're thinking about something is incorrect. I have to try and provide them with the tools to build that foundation on their own. But that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, at least in science classes, is those preconceived those ideas that they come in with already.
Well, thank you all. We are at 4:30. I know a couple of people have had to leave to go to another event. I wish we had more time because I have more questions. So you might find me emailing you with questions over the next week. But I want to thank you, all three of you, for joining us today. And we will be posting the recording of this session on the PI website, so those who were not able to attend will still have access. And I also want to thank all of you who joined us today. I appreciate your time and attention. Thanks very much.